The radio went dead at 7:52 in the morning. 480 Marines, pinned, bleeding, burning inside a valley that had just become a kill box, and not one asset in the entire United States military could reach them in time. Artillery was danger close. Helicopters couldn't land. CAS couldn't clear the angles. The men making decisions were out of options. But one woman, unauthorized, unassigned, and already walking out the gate alone, had seen this coming 2 days ago. They laughed at her in the briefing room. They called her the quiet sniper nobody needed. She didn't argue. She just picked up her rifle and climbed the mountain herself. If that hits you, subscribe right now and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The briefing room smelled like burnt coffee and overconfidence. That was how Elena Cruz always described it later. Not the maps on the wall, not the officers crowding the front rows, not the satellite images projected across the screen, just that smell, burnt coffee and overconfidence. The two most dangerous things in a forward operating base. She sat in the back row, the way she always did, not because she was told to, not because protocol required it, but because the back row was the only place in any room where you could see everything at once. Every face, every reaction, every moment someone stopped listening and started assuming. Elena Cruz was very good at watching what other people missed. She was 31 years old, 5'7", dark hair pulled tight beneath her cover. She had the kind of face that made people underestimate her at first glance. Calm, quiet, unremarkable in a crowd. She'd been told that her whole career. Quiet, like it was a flaw, like silence was something a Marine should be ashamed of. She wore the crossed rifles of a scout sniper. She had been wearing them for 6 years. In that time, she had qualified expert on every long-range weapons platform the Marine Corps fielded, trained alongside 2 different special operations units as an attached observer, and completed a confirmed engagement at 1,140 meters during a deployment that most people in this room had never heard about because the mission itself was still classified. None of that was written on her forehead, so the men at the front of the room didn't know it. That was fine. She'd stopped needing them to know a long time ago. Lieutenant Colonel David Marsh stood at the front, using a laser pointer like a man who had never doubted a single decision in his life. He was not a bad commander. Elena had served under far worse. But Marsh was the kind of officer who had been right enough times in enough easy situations that he had confused experience with certainty. And that distinction, in her world, was the difference between coming home and not coming home. The valley is designated Objective Falcon, Marsh said, sweeping the pointer across the terrain map. 3 clicks long, approximately 400 meters wide at the narrowest point. Intel has confirmed a secondary insurgent staging area at the northern end, estimated 20 to 30 personnel, light weapons, limited anti-air capability. He clicked to the next slide. 3rd Battalion will execute a 3-pronged sweep beginning at 0600. Alpha and Bravo companies enter from the south. Charlie holds the eastern approach. We clear the valley, neutralize the staging area, and extract before 1600. Questions? Elena was already looking at the terrain overlay. She had been looking at it since the slide appeared, and something in her chest had gone very, very still. The valley floor was wrong. Not the kind of wrong you could explain in a sentence. The kind of wrong you felt first. A cold mechanical recognition that moved through her training before it reached her words. The valley wasn't open ground the way Marsh was describing it. The ridge lines on both sides weren't parallel. They converged at the northern end, tightening like a fist. The eastern approach that Charlie Company was assigned to hold sat at a lower elevation than the surrounding terrain, which meant anything positioned on those ridges had a direct, unobstructed angle down into the valley floor. 3 ridges, natural firing lanes, no dead ground for cover. It wasn't a valley, it was a bowl. She raised her hand. The room didn't go quiet. A few officers glanced back, most didn't. Marsh looked up from his notes. His expression wasn't hostile. It was patient in the way that people are patient when they're already done listening. "Sergeant Cruz." "Sir," she stood. "I've been looking at the terrain overlay for Objective Falcon. I want to flag something about the geometry of the northern ridgelines." "Go ahead." She kept her voice neutral, flat, the way she'd learned to present information to people who were already halfway to dismissing it. "The ridge on the western side crests approximately 60 meters higher than the valley floor at the point where Alpha and Bravo will converge. The eastern ridge mirrors that angle on the opposite side. Any force positioned at the northern end of those ridges has direct line of sight and unobstructed fire angles down onto the valley floor for the entire length of the objective." She paused. "Sir, that valley is a kill box. If there's anything more than light resistance at the northern end, if they've had time to position crew-served weapons on those ridges, we're sending 480 Marines into a situation where they cannot maneuver, cannot take cover, and cannot be extracted by air without the helicopters entering the same fire angles." The room was quiet for about 2 seconds. Then Captain Harris, Alpha Company Commander, third row from the front, the kind of man who wore his combat patch like a medal he was always touching, laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh. It was the easy, dismissive laugh of someone who doesn't realize they're being cruel. "Cruz," he said, turning around in his seat, "Intel confirmed 20 to 30 fighters, light weapons. You want to hold the entire battalion because of the geometry?" "Sir, I want the battalion to go in with a plan that accounts for the geometry." "The geometry." Harris repeated it like the word was funny. "The terrain doesn't care about our intel estimates, sir." Marsh set down his laser pointer. "Sergeant Cruz, I appreciate the analysis, but we have 2 days of drone surveillance over that valley. We have signal intercepts. We have ground source reporting. The intel picture is solid." "With respect, sir, solid intel on the northern staging area doesn't account for what might be sitting on those ridges right now." Marsh looked at her for a long moment. It wasn't a dismissive look. It wasn't hostile. It was something Elena recognized more than either of those things. It was the look of a man who had already made his decision and was now simply waiting for the conversation to end. "We'll have eyes on the ridgelines during ingress," he said. "If we see anything that changes the picture, we adapt. That's what Marines do." She nodded once. "Yes, sir." She sat down. Harris turned back to the front. She heard him say something quiet to the captain beside him. She didn't catch all of it. She caught the word radios. "Stick to radios, Cruz." She wrote 4 words in the small notebook she always carried. "Northern Ridges, 20 minutes." Then she closed it. The convoy moved out at 06:15. Elena stood outside the motor pool and watched the vehicles roll through the gate. MRAPs and 7 tons and 2 command vehicles at the back. The whole machine of a battalion in motion. Dust rising off the hard-packed road in long orange trails. She was not on the manifest. Marsh hadn't officially excluded her. He hadn't needed to. The mission roster had been finalized the day before the briefing, and her name hadn't been on it. That was the standard reality of her assignment to 3rd Battalion. She was attached as a technical advisor on a temporary basis, present for training cycles and planning sessions, available for consultation but not operationally integrated. There was a reason for that, and it was the same reason there was always a reason. The battalion already had 2 assigned sniper teams, both male, both with longer service records within the unit. She was the extra, the advisor, the woman in the back row. She watched the last vehicle clear the gate, and then she went back inside and sat down at the intelligence terminal and pulled up the live drone feed. The cameras were already over the valley. She watched. For the first 40 minutes, the feed was routine. Vehicles moving through the southern approach, squads dismounting and pushing into buildings at the valley's lower end. Status reports coming in over the radio net. Clean, methodical. the sound of a mission going exactly the way it was supposed to go. Elena watched the ridgelines. She watched the way the morning light moved across the high ground on the western side. She watched the dark patches where rock formations created natural depressions, the kind of depressions that, in her experience, were either empty or they weren't, and you only found out which one when the firing started. At 0742, something moved on the western ridge. It was small. The drone camera was at altitude, the resolution compressed by distance, and under normal circumstances, a trained analyst might have flagged it as an anomaly and moved on. But Elena Cruz had spent 6 years looking at terrain through scopes, and she knew, with a certainty that sat below language and above instinct, that what she was looking at was not a rock formation. She grabbed the radio handset. "Operations, this is Cruz. I need to talk to someone in the TOC right now." The voice on the other end was Captain Yates, the battalion operations officer, a man she'd worked with twice, a decent officer. "Cruz, what have you got?" "I'm watching the drone feed. Western Ridge, grid 174. I'm seeing possible movement in the rock formations at the crest. I need someone to task the drone lower for a closer pass." A pause. "Cruz, the drone's currently supporting Alpha Company's clearance operation. I can't redirect it without Marsh's authorization." "Then I need you to get Marsh on the radio." Another pause. Longer. "He's forward with Alpha, Cruz. He's not available right now." "Yates," she kept her voice level, "if there are crew-served weapons on that ridge, and the battalion pushes to the northern end without knowing it, I need you to understand what I'm telling you. That is not a firefight. That is a massacre." Silence on the other end. Then, "Cruz, I hear you, but I can't redirect battalion assets based on a visual anomaly on a compressed feed. Get me something concrete and I'll escalate it." She put the handset down. She looked at the screen. At 0759, the Western Ridge opened fire. The sound reached the TOC before the picture changed. A burst of static on the tactical radio net, then multiple voices talking at once, then a single voice cutting through everything, calm and hard and unmistakable. "Contact! Contact north! We've got guns on the ridge, machine gun, crew-served, northwest quadrant. Alpha's taking fire. We need..." The voice cut out. Another one came up. "Bravo 6, this is Bravo 2 actual. We've got RPG teams on the Eastern Ridge. I say again, Eastern Ridge. Lead vehicle is hit. We've got casualties." Then another. "All stations this net, Falcon is compromised. I say again, Falcon is compromised." Elena was already standing. The talk erupted around her. Officers on radios, analysts pulling up feeds, someone shouting for a medevac authorization, someone else trying to reach the artillery firebase. She moved through it all without speaking, and she went to the window that faced north toward the mountains, and she looked at the valley she could no longer see from here, and she understood exactly what was happening down there. The battalion was in the bowl. The ridges were active on both sides. That meant the eastern position she'd flagged at the briefing had been occupied too, probably overnight, probably staged before any of the drone surveillance had been run. The lead vehicles were already hit. RPG teams on the Eastern Ridge meant the extraction routes were covered. Machine guns on the Western Ridge meant the valley floor was exposed from above. 480 Marines, no cover, no maneuver room, no clear extraction corridor. She heard Yates on the radio, trying to reach Marsh, trying to coordinate, trying to build a picture that was changing faster than anyone in the TOC could track. She heard the fear underneath the professionalism, the tight, controlled fear of trained people watching something catastrophic unfold at speed. She heard Harris's voice on the net. He wasn't laughing now. "Command, this is Alpha 6. We are pinned. I say again, we are pinned. We have 2 KIA, 6 WIA, and we cannot advance or withdraw. The valley floor is fully covered from the western ridgeline. We need CAS. We need artillery. We need something." The artillery officer was already shaking his head. Danger close. The battalion's mixed in with the target area. I can't clear fires without killing our own people. What about CAS? CAS can't identify clean targets in that terrain. Same problem. What about the helicopters? Silence. Everyone in the room knew what the silence meant. The same ridge lines that had the valley floor covered also had the landing zones covered. Any helicopter entering that bowl would fly directly into the fire envelope of every weapon system the enemy had positioned up there. Elena turned around. She looked at the drone feed one more time. She looked at the western ridge. She looked at the approach, the backside, the steep face that nobody had bothered to map in detail because no tactical asset was going to climb a 70-degree rock face during an active operation. She calculated the distance, the elevation, the time. Then she walked to the equipment room, put on her kit, picked up her rifle, and walked toward the door. Cruz. Yates's voice stopped her. He was staring at her. Where are you going? She looked at him. To fix the geometry, sir. She walked out before he could answer. The climb took 2 hours and 40 minutes. She didn't think about the briefing room. She didn't think about Harris's laugh or Marsh's patient dismissal or the word radios. She thought about the terrain beneath her hands and the wind and the distance and the 480 people at the bottom of that valley who were still alive because the enemy was being methodical rather than decisive. And methodical enemies gave you time, and time was the only currency she needed right now. She climbed the back face of the western ridge alone, moving in the spaces between firing positions, using the rock the way she'd been trained to use it, not as cover, but as concealment, not as something to hide behind, but as something to disappear into. The sound of the firefight below rose and fell in waves. She could hear it clearly by the time she reached the upper third of the climb, the hammer of machine guns, the crack of rifles, the occasional deep percussion of an RPG detonation. She focused on the next handhold, then the next. At the crest, she found a narrow shelf between two granite formations, barely wide enough to set a stable firing position, but stable enough. She flattened herself onto it and brought the rifle up and looked through the scope for the first time since she'd left the compound. The battlefield opened up beneath her. She saw it all at once, the way she'd always been able to see a battlefield, as a system rather than a chaos, as a geometry of cause and effect, where every element had a relationship to every other element. She saw the machine gun nest on the lower western shelf, 200 meters below and to her left, its crew pouring fire into the valley floor where Alpha Company was pinned behind disabled vehicles. She saw the RPG team on the eastern ridge, too far for a reliable shot at this angle, but she noted their position. She saw the command node in the rocks at the northern tip of the ridge, 2 men with radios, coordinating the whole operation with the calm efficiency of people who had planned this for a long time. She noted the wind, she noted the distance, she settled her breathing, and she went to work. The first shot was at 430 meters. The machine gun had been firing for 6 minutes straight. It had already killed 2 Marines on the valley floor and had a 3rd platoon completely suppressed behind the burning wreck of a 7-ton. The gunner never saw what hit him. The gun went silent. On the radio net, she could hear it through the earpiece she'd brought. A voice cut through the tactical chaos, raw and disbelieving. The gun on the western ridge just stopped. Did we get CAS? Command, did you get CAS authorized? The ridge gun just stopped. Another voice. Negative on CAS. We don't have CAS. A pause. Then what just? She was already moving, not running, never running, moving with the precise, unhurried economy of someone who understood that panic wasted more time than it saved, that the next shot mattered more than the last one, that the battlefield didn't reward emotion, it rewarded accuracy. She found the RPG team that had been targeting the evacuation corridor at the valley's southern end. They were 560 meters away, across the open air above the valley. their position elevated on a natural rock shelf. She saw the gunner lining up on a vehicle that was trying to move wounded Marines toward the southern exit. She fired once. The shot was 9 inches high due to a thermal layer she hadn't fully accounted for. She felt it before she saw it, that slight wrongness in the recoil impulse, and she adjusted without pausing, worked the bolt, fired again. The RPG team stopped moving. The vehicle made it to the southern end of the valley. Below her, on the radio net, a new voice came up. It was a young voice, a corporal or maybe a sergeant, she couldn't tell. And the voice wasn't tactical. It wasn't a status report or a coordinate. It was something she hadn't heard on a radio in a long time. "Command, somebody's up on that ridge. There's somebody up there taking them apart. I don't know who it is. I don't know how they got there, but somebody is cutting them to pieces." She had been in the mountains for less than 40 minutes. Below her, 480 Marines were still alive, and the battle was only half over. The corporal's voice stayed on the radio for 3 seconds before discipline pulled him back into the fight. But those 3 seconds mattered, because every Marine who heard it, every man pinned behind a burning vehicle, every squad leader pressing his back against a wall and counting ammunition, heard something they hadn't heard since the first gun opened up on that ridge. They heard the possibility that this wasn't over. Down on the valley floor, Sergeant First Class Danny Reyes was bleeding from his left forearm, and he didn't care. He had 4 men behind a disabled MRAP, 2 of them unable to move on their own, and the machine gun that had been chewing through the valley for the last 25 minutes had just stopped mid-burst, like someone had reached down from the sky and unplugged it. He'd heard the corporal's transmission. He didn't know what to make of it, but he knew the gun was quiet, and quiet meant movement, and movement meant someone was still in this fight. "Sanchez," he said without raising his voice. "You hear that?" Private First Class Sanchez was pressing a pressure dressing against the shoulder of the man next to him. He didn't look up. "I heard it. You think it's real?" "The gun stopped, didn't it?" Reyes looked at the ridge. He couldn't see anything up there. That was the point. Whoever was working that position didn't want to be seen, but something had reached into the geometry of this ambush and broken it, just slightly, just enough. "Stay low," he said. "Stay low and stay tight. Something's happening up there." Elena didn't know their names. She never did from this distance. They were shapes in a scope, positions on a mental map, problems with solutions. That was the discipline, the trained separation between what you felt and what you did, because in this work the two could not occupy the same space at the same moment. You felt everything afterward. During, you calculated. She moved laterally along the crest, staying below the silhouette line, finding the next position she needed. The western ridge ran approximately 800 meters from the point where she'd established her first firing position to the northern tip where she'd seen the command node. She had to assume there were observers, fighters assigned to watch the ridgeline, specifically watching for exactly what she was doing. That meant every move had to use the terrain, and the terrain on this ridge was unforgiving. She was 120 meters from her first position when she heard the movement. Not movement toward her, movement above her, loose rocks shifting, the unmistakable sound of someone descending from a higher point. She stopped moving immediately, pressed flat. Her breathing slowed without her choosing it, the way it always did when the situation changed faster than the plan. She listened. 2 people, maybe 3, moving down toward the lower shelf where the machine gun had been, probably sent to find out why it had stopped firing. She could hear them talking. Not words she could make out, just tone and cadence, low and careful. The voice of someone who knew something was wrong and hadn't decided yet how wrong. She had maybe 30 seconds. She mapped what she knew. They were above and to her right, coming down a route that would bring them within 60 meters of her position. The angle meant she couldn't engage without exposing her silhouette. She had 2 choices: Fall back down the ridge and lose everything she gained in the last 2 hours, or hold and wait. She held. She pressed herself into a gap between two rock formations and made herself as small as the space allowed, and she didn't breathe. And she listened to them come closer, and she counted seconds. They passed within 40 meters of her. She heard one of them stop. She heard him say something. She heard the other one respond. She couldn't understand the language, but she understood the conversation. Something happened here. I don't know what. Let's keep moving. The universal language of soldiers who have been sent to check on a problem and don't have a good answer. They moved past her. She gave them 90 seconds to get clear. Then she moved. In the TOC, Captain Yates had stopped trying to reach Marsh on the radio. That wasn't because he'd given up. It was because Marsh had come back on the net himself, his voice compressed and tight in the way that voices get when someone is genuinely afraid and using every bit of their training to prevent it from showing. Operations, this is Falcon 6 Actual. We are at the northern end of the valley. We have significant casualties. Alpha and Bravo are separated. Bravo is pinned south of the grid line. Alpha is attempting to consolidate at the vehicle line. The ridge guns are intermittently suppressing both positions. I need a status on CAS, and I need it now. Yates keyed the mic. Falcon 6, CAS assets are 30 minutes out minimum. Artillery is danger close to all friendly positions. We cannot get you fires without significant risk to your personnel. A pause. What about the ridge gun? It went quiet 10 minutes ago. Unknown, sir. We have unconfirmed reports of possible friendly sniper activity on the western ridge. Another pause. This one longer. Say again? Sir, there are multiple radio transmissions from the valley floor reporting that someone is engaging enemy positions from the western ridge. We cannot confirm identity or authorization. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that happens when a senior officer is recalculating everything at once. Yates, Marsh's voice was quieter now. Who do we have that could be on that ridge right now? Yates looked across the TOC at the empty chair where Elena Cruz had been sitting 40 minutes ago. He didn't answer immediately. Yates, harder now, who is on my ridge? Sir, Yates said, I believe it's Sergeant Cruz. The silence came back, longer than before. When Marsh spoke again, his voice had changed in a way that Yates couldn't quite name. It wasn't anger. It wasn't relief. It was something more complicated than either of those things. Something that happened to a person when the world around them suddenly rearranges itself into a shape they didn't expect. Is she effective up there? Yates thought about the machine gun that had stopped, the RPG team that had gone quiet, the vehicle that had made it to the southern end of the valley. Sir, he said carefully, I think so. She found the second crew serve position 20 minutes after the patrol passed her. It was set up on a natural ledge. 2 men, a belt-fed weapon, positioned to cover the eastern half of the valley floor where Bravo Company was consolidated. They hadn't been firing continuously, which was smart, disciplined, controlled bursts to keep the Marines pinned, conserving ammunition, waiting for something, maybe a signal from the command node at the northern tip. She was 380 meters away. The wind had shifted since she'd taken her first shot. She'd been tracking it for the last 15 minutes, gusting from the northwest, inconsistent, the kind of variable wind that made long-distance shooting feel like an argument with physics. She laid still and waited for a lull. 3 seconds, 8 seconds, 12 seconds. The wind dropped. She fired. The weapon went silent, and down in the valley, something shifted. Danny Reyes heard the second gun stop, and this time he didn't wait for confirmation. We're moving, he said, right now. Sanchez, take Torres. Monroe, you're on Garza. We move south along the vehicle line, and we don't stop. Sarge, there's still fire from the eastern ridge. There's less fire from the eastern ridge than there was 60 seconds ago. And if whoever's up on that western ridge keeps doing what they're doing, there's going to be less again in another 60 seconds. We move now while we have the window. Sanchez looked at him. You don't even know who's up there. I don't care who's up there. I care that they're buying us time. He grabbed Sanchez by the sleeve. Move. They moved. Across the valley, in 3 different places, similar conversations were happening. Not because anyone had issued an order, not because the radio net had coordinated a movement, but because the animal intelligence of soldiers under fire, the part that processes information before the conscious mind catches up, was recognizing something. The pressure was changing. The kill zone was breathing. And somewhere up on that ridge, something was dismantling the architecture of their death, one piece at a time. Elena was halfway to the command node when she made the mistake. She'd been moving for nearly an hour and a half on the ridge, and the physical toll was real, even if she wasn't letting herself feel it. The climb had taken everything her legs had. The lateral movement along the crest was harder than the climb. Less grip, steeper angles, the constant discipline of staying below the silhouette line on a ridge that narrowed as it pushed north. She'd eaten nothing, drunk nothing except the water in the 2 bottles she'd clipped to her kit before leaving. She was crossing a gap in the rock when her left boot found loose shale instead of solid stone. She went down. Not far, maybe 2 feet before her right hand caught a lip of granite and arrested the fall. But her knee hit rock hard, and the impact sent a bright, clean spike of pain up through her leg that she felt all the way to her jaw. And the sound of it, boot on stone, body on rock, was louder than anything she'd done in the last 90 minutes. She held completely still. Her knee was bad. She didn't know how bad. She couldn't afford to know right now. She ran a fast assessment. Weight-bearing, yes. Mobility, reduced. Range of motion, painful but present. Structural, probably intact. Probably. She listened. 40 seconds of silence. Then a voice from above and to her right, closer than the last patrol, much closer, maybe 70 meters. And this one wasn't moving away from her. This one was moving toward her. She had no shot from her current position. The angle was wrong, the cover was wrong, and she was on the ground with a compromised leg and exactly 0 room for a second mistake. She thought about the valley. She thought about Reyes and Sanchez and the people she'd never met who were moving through corridors she'd cut into the battle with the last 2 hours of her life. She thought about 480 Marines and the arithmetic of what happened if she stopped moving right now. She pulled herself up on one leg, tested the knee, accepted the pain, and kept going. The voice on the radio net changed the entire dynamic of the TOC. It was Marsh coming back up, and his voice had shed the tight professional fear and replaced it with something colder and more focused. Operations, this is Falcon 6. I need a route assessment for the Southern Extraction Corridor. Specifically, I need to know if the choke point at grid 177 is clear. Yates pulled up the drone feed. The camera had been retasked to the southern end of the valley 10 minutes ago, and what it showed was not nothing. There were still fighters covering the southern approach, 2 positions, one on each side of the exit point. A vehicle trying to push through there right now would be hit from both sides. Sir, the southern choke point is still active. 2 enemy positions covering the exit. Can your sniper reach them from her current position? A silence in the TOC. Sir, I don't have comms with the asset. I'm aware you don't have comms. I'm asking if she can reach them. Yates looked at the map. He looked at the drone feed. He tried to put Elena Cruz somewhere on that ridge based on what he knew. First shot from the upper western crest. Second shot from a position 200 meters south of that. The trajectory of the engagements pointing north toward the command node. Sir, if she's where I think she is, she's on the wrong side of the ridge for the southern choke point. Marsh said nothing for 5 seconds. Then I need to find another way out. She found the command node at 1400 hours. 2 men with radios, exactly where she'd seen them from her first position. They were positioned in a natural alcove in the rock at the northern tip of the ridge, partially sheltered from above, completely exposed from her angle. They were the center of this operation. She understood that now. She'd been watching the pattern of fire across the valley for the last hour, and every coordinated burst, every shift in the enemy's targeting, every time the pressure had spiked or eased, it had followed a transmission from this position. They weren't just observers. They were conducting the battle in real time, adjusting the trap as the Marines moved within it. Take them out, and the trap goes deaf. She was 450 meters away. Her knee was sending a steady, low-grade signal up through her leg that she'd categorized as manageable and filed away somewhere behind her focus. The wind was still variable, but she'd been tracking it long enough to read the pattern. There was a 4 to 6 second window every 40 seconds or so when it dropped to near zero. She steadied herself. She waited for the window. On the radio net below, she could hear the battle still grinding. Harris's voice, tight and professional now, directing Alpha Company through a consolidation maneuver. Reyes, she didn't know, but someone was calling in a casualty update that included the word stable twice, which was not the word she'd been afraid of hearing. The wind dropped. She fired once. She worked the bolt. She fired again. The command node went silent. And then, not immediately, not all at once, but with the gradual and unmistakable quality of a system losing its coordination, the fire across the valley began to fragment. Bursts that had been synchronized became isolated. Positions that had been communicating went independent. The geometry of the ambush, which had been maintained by those two men and their radios for the last 2.5 hours, began to dissolve. Down on the valley floor, Harris felt it before he understood it. Bravo 6, this is Alpha 6. Something just changed. Their coordination is gone. I'm watching it happen. They're firing independently now. This is our window. Say again, this is our window. We need to move now. Bravo's commander came back immediately. Alpha 6, confirm. What changed? I don't know what changed. I know it changed. Move. The radio in the TOC erupted with movement reports. Multiple units, simultaneously, without central coordination, pushing toward the southern extraction corridor. The choke point was still active, but the fire was less disciplined now. Shorter bursts, more reactive. The difference between a hunting pack working together and individual animals making individual decisions. Yates was watching the drone feed and trying to reach Marsh and tracking 4 different conversations on the radio net when the analyst beside him pointed at the screen. Sir, Western Ridge, look. He looked. A figure moving slowly along the northern tip of the ridge, limping, carrying a rifle, moving down the far side of the crest toward a descent route that would bring them out at the valley's northern approach. The wrong direction from base, the wrong direction from safety, but the only direction that didn't require crossing active enemy positions. Yates stared at the screen for a long moment. Is that? I think so, sir. He thought about the woman who had stood in the back row of that briefing room 2 days ago and told Marsh exactly what was going to happen. He thought about her walking out of the TOC with a rifle, and one sentence that he had not been able to stop thinking about since she'd said it. To fix the geometry, sir. On the drone screen, the figure kept moving, slowly, deliberately, not retreating. The body language was wrong for retreat. This was someone who had finished what they came to do and was now, very carefully, finding the way home. Yates keyed the radio. All stations this net, all stations. We have a friendly asset extracting from the northern ridge. I say again, friendly asset extracting from the northern ridge. Do not engage. I say again, do not engage anything on that ridge. A voice came back, and he recognized it as Marsh, and there was something in the texture of it that he had never heard from that man before. Yates, is she mobile? He watched the screen. Yes, sir, she's mobile. A pause. Tell me she's going to make it. Yates watched the figure move through the rocks, watched it favor one leg and then correct, "Keep going," refused to stop. "Sir," he said, "I don't think anything's going to stop her." Below her, the valley was beginning to breathe again. She couldn't see it from where she was. She was on the northern descent, moving through terrain that hid the valley floor from her. But she could hear the radio net, and the radio net was telling her everything. Movement reports, casualty updates, the helicopter coordinator coming up on frequency asking for a landing zone status. A voice she didn't recognize calling out that the southern choke point was clear. Both positions taken out by a squad that had finally found room to maneuver. Room she had given them. Her knee had stiffened on the descent, and every step down was a negotiation between her body and her will was winning, but only just. She kept moving. She did not think about the pain. She thought about the voice on the radio, that young corporal, that raw, disbelieving voice that had said, "Somebody is cutting them to pieces." She thought about what it felt like to be on the other end of that, to be the person in the valley who suddenly, impossibly, realized that someone had climbed above the trap and was tearing it apart with their bare hands. She had been that person once, on a different mountain, in a different country. She knew what it meant to hear a gun go quiet when there was no explanation. She knew what it did to the calculus of survival, how it shifted the weight of the impossible just slightly, just enough, towards something that might actually be endured. She had wanted her whole career to be the kind of soldier who could give that to someone else. The ridge narrowed below her, and the descent leveled out, and she could see the terrain opening up ahead, the long, flat approach that eventually connected back to the road that led back to the compound. Her compass told her she was 4 kilometers from the gate. Her knee told her that 4 kilometers was going to take a while. She didn't care. She kept walking, and somewhere behind her, in the valley she had just spent 3 hours cutting open, one shot at a time, the helicopters were finally coming in. The helicopters came in low and fast, the way they always do when the landing zone isn't fully clean. The first one touched down for 11 seconds. 11 seconds to load 4 wounded Marines, 2 of them on litters, one of them not conscious enough to know he was being moved. Then the rotors bit the air again, and it was gone, banking hard south, and the second one was already coming in before the dust from the first one settled. Danny Reyes stood at the edge of the improvised landing zone and counted heads. That was his job right now. Not fighting, not leading, just counting, making sure every man in his element was accounted for before the last bird lifted. He had 6 men. He counted 6 men. He counted them again because the habit was too deep to break, because in his experience the worst moments in a Marine's life came from the things you assumed rather than the things you verified. 6 men. He let himself exhale. Torres was beside him, his left arm in a makeshift sling, his face the particular shade of pale that came from blood loss and adrenaline withdrawal. He was watching the ridge the way everyone was watching the ridge, that involuntary pull of the eyes toward the high ground, the place where something had happened that none of them fully understood yet. "You think it was Cruz?" Torres asked. Reyes didn't answer immediately. He'd been thinking about it for the last 40 minutes, ever since the second gun went quiet and the command node stopped talking and the whole structure of the ambush had begun to come apart like a machine with its drive shaft removed. He'd heard her name on the battalion net, a fragment of a transmission, Yates's voice, friendly asset extracting from the northern ridge. He hadn't been certain, but certainty wasn't really the point. "Yeah," he said, "I think it was Cruz." Torres looked at him. "The sniper from the briefing?" "The sniper from the briefing." A pause. "The one Harris told to stick to radios." "That's the one." Torres was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in the way that soldiers sometimes say things when the weight of a fact lands on them all at once, "She climbed that ridge alone." "Yeah." "With a bum knee from what I'm hearing." "Yeah." Torres looked back at the ridge. His jaw was tight, not with anger, with something more complicated than anger, Something that happened to a person when they realized they had almost died because someone in a room full of confident men hadn't been willing to listen to the quietest person in the room. "We almost didn't make it out," he said. Reyes didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say to that. It was true. It was completely, irreversibly true, and saying it out loud didn't change it, and arguing with it was pointless. They had almost not made it out, and then they had made it out, and the distance between those two outcomes had walked out of a compound alone and climbed a 70-degree rock face with a rifle, and spent 3 hours doing what 480 trained Marines and all the firepower of a forward operating base had not been able to do from the valley below. The third helicopter came in. "Move," Reyes said. They moved. Marsh made it back to the compound at 1640. He came off the last helicopter with his uniform marked by 6 hours of valley dust and the particular hollowness in his face that combat commanders carry when they've just spent an afternoon counting their dead and knowing in the deepest part of themselves that the number should have been higher, much higher. The final count was 7 killed in action, 23 wounded. Every one of the 480 Marines who had entered that valley had come back out of it. He stood in the motor pool for a moment before going anywhere else. Just stood. The kind of stillness that isn't peace. It's the moment after the adrenaline leaves and the body doesn't know what to do with the silence. Yates found him there. "Sir," Marsh looked at him. "Cruz? She walked in 40 minutes ago, sir. She's with the corpsman. They think it's a bone bruise, possibly a hairline fracture. She's ambulatory. She refused a stretcher." Of course she did, Marsh thought. Of course she refused a stretcher. "I want to see her." "Yes, sir, she's in the aid station." He walked across the compound and he was aware, in a way he hadn't been before, of the Marines he passed. The ones from the valley, the ones still in their dusty kit, the ones moving quietly in groups of 2 and 3 in the way that people move after something has rearranged their understanding of how close the edge actually is. Some of them looked at him. He met those looks without looking away because he had earned that at least. The willingness to be looked at by the men he had led into a bowl and almost lost. He stopped outside the aid station. Through the opening, he could see Elena Cruz sitting on a cot with her left leg extended, a corpsman wrapping her knee with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing this all day. Her rifle was leaned against the cot beside her. Her kit was still on. Her face was the same face it had been in the briefing room 2 days ago. Calm, attentive, giving nothing away. Marsh stepped inside. The corpsman looked up, registered the rank, and immediately made himself scarce. It was an instinct, officers having conversations that required privacy, and it left Marsh and Elena Cruz alone in the aid station, with the sound of the compound outside, and the kind of silence that sits between people who both know exactly what needs to be said, and neither one has said it yet. Marsh pulled a chair over and sat down. He hadn't planned what he was going to say. He thought about it on the helicopter, thought about the words he would use, the acknowledgement he would make, the precise professional language that would address what had happened without collapsing into something he wasn't sure he had words for yet. All of that left him the moment he sat down. "You disobeyed a direct order," he said. Elena looked at him. "I didn't receive a direct order not to go, sir. You left this compound without authorization during an active combat operation." "Yes, sir. Without telling anyone where you were going." "I told Captain Yates I was going to fix the geometry, sir." Something moved across Marsh's face. It might have been the beginning of something that, under different circumstances, could have become a smile. "Cruz." His voice dropped the formality. Not all the way. He was still a lieutenant colonel, and she was still a staff sergeant, and that distance didn't disappear because of what had happened on a ridge. But it dropped enough. "What you did up there, I need to understand it. Not officially, not for the report. I just need to understand it." Elena was quiet for a moment. "The geometry was wrong, sir. From the moment the firing started, I could see it on the drone feed. The battalion had no maneuver space, no cover, no extraction route that wasn't covered by enemy fires. Artillery couldn't help. CAS couldn't help. There was no asset that could reach those positions from the valley floor or from the air. She paused. The only place the geometry worked from was the ridge itself. So you climbed it? Yes, sir. Alone, with no authorization, no comms with a TOC, no extraction plan, no. If I'd waited for authorization, sir, the window would have closed. Marsh looked at her for a long time. 7 men didn't make it home today, he said quietly. No, sir. Without what you did on that ridge, that number would have been... He stopped. He didn't finish the sentence. He couldn't finish it because finishing it required him to sit fully inside the arithmetic of what he'd done by dismissing her in that briefing room. And he wasn't ready to sit fully inside that yet. Elena didn't fill the silence. She never filled silences. She waited. I owe you an apology, Marsh said, for the briefing room, for not listening. Sir, don't. He said it without hardness. Don't tell me it's fine. It wasn't fine. You were right. I was wrong. And Marines died because I didn't listen to you. I'm going to carry that. I should carry that. He leaned forward, elbows on knees. But I want you to know that I understand what you did today, and I'm not going to forget it. Elena looked at him. There were 100 things she could have said in that moment. She'd rehearsed some version of this conversation in the back of her mind for years. Not with Marsh specifically, but with every version of every officer who had looked past her in a briefing room, or handed her a radio assignment, or made her name into a punchline about radios. She'd rehearsed it, and she'd put it away, and she'd stopped needing it to happen. Because needing something from people who weren't going to give it to you was a form of suffering she'd decided a long time ago she wasn't interested in. But here it was, being given, unsolicited and unperformed. Thank you, sir, she said, and that was enough. Harris found her an hour later. She'd been moved from the aid station to a cot in the senior NCO quarters, her knee elevated, her rifle still within arm's reach. She was reading something on her phone, not scrolling, actually reading, with the focused attention of someone who used quiet moments to do things that required thought. Harris stood in the doorway for a moment before she looked up. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, the kind of Marine who looked like he'd been manufactured for combat. He had the combat patch and the confident jaw and everything that went with the surface of him. He also had, Elena noticed, the look of someone who had spent the last 2 hours sitting inside a very uncomfortable truth. Cruz, she looked at him. Sir. He came in and stood at the end of the cot and didn't sit, which she understood. Sitting would have required a kind of ease that he didn't have right now, and she respected the honesty of that. I lost 2 men today, he said. I know, sir. I'm sorry. Before you started working the ridge, I was looking at losing all of them. He said it flat, not fishing for a response, just stating a fact that he needed to say out loud to someone. I was on the radio calling for assets that didn't exist, and I was watching my Marines die one at a time, and He stopped. I didn't see a way out. Elena said nothing. And then the gun went quiet. He looked at the floor. And then the second gun went quiet. And I still didn't know what was happening. I thought maybe we'd gotten lucky, some kind of malfunction. I didn't. It took me an embarrassingly long time to understand that it wasn't luck. It doesn't matter how long it took, sir. It matters to me. He looked up at her. In the briefing room, what I said, what I implied. You don't have to. Stick to radios, Cruz. He said it like he was putting the words on a table between them, naming them, refusing to let them hide. That's what I said. In front of the entire room, he shook his head. I had no idea who you were. I had no idea what you were capable of. And I dismissed you like... He stopped again. Like you were a distraction. Elena looked at him steadily. Sir, with respect, the dismissal wasn't what mattered. I've been dismissed before. I'll be dismissed again. What mattered was that 480 people were walking into a kill box, and nobody with the authority to change the plan was willing to look at the evidence. She paused. That's what I was afraid of. Not the dismissal, the consequence of it. Harris was quiet for a moment. You weren't afraid on that ridge? I didn't have time to be afraid on that ridge, sir. He looked at her like he was seeing something he hadn't expected to see. Not a revelation, more like a recognition. The moment when you look at a person who has been in the same room with you and realize that what you were looking at and what was actually there were two completely different things. For the record, he said quietly, I'm going to say something I don't say often enough and probably should have said a long time ago to a lot of people. He held her gaze. I was wrong. You were right. And I'm grateful. He turned and walked out before she could respond. She watched him go. Then she looked back at her phone, and she didn't read anything, because the words weren't registering anymore. She was thinking about 7 names she didn't know yet, the 7 who hadn't made it out. And she was doing what she always did when the discipline of the work finally loosened its grip and let the feeling back in. She sat with it. She let it be what it was. The debrief happened at 1900 in the main conference room. Every senior officer in the battalion was there. Intel, operations, logistics, the medical officer with casualty figures, the communications officer with a timeline of the radio traffic. It was the anatomy of a disaster examined with the clinical efficiency that the military brought to everything. Because the point wasn't to assign blame in the room, the point was to understand exactly what had failed and why, so that the next time someone walked into a briefing with a question about the geometry, the room wouldn't laugh. Marsh ran it himself. He started at the beginning, the intel assessment, the planning assumptions, the dismissal of Elena's terrain analysis, and he didn't soften any of it. He named every failure by its actual name. He did not use language that distributed the responsibility so evenly that no one person had to carry any of it. He named his own decisions specifically, and he named what they had cost. The room was very quiet. Partway through the debrief, when Marsh reached the point in the timeline when the first gun had gone quiet, and nobody in the talk had understood why, he paused. At approximately 0815, he said, an unauthorized asset engaged the primary machine gun position on the western ridge from a firing position at the crest. That asset then proceeded to engage 7 additional enemy positions over the following 3 hours, including the command node that was coordinating the entire ambush. He looked around the room. That asset was Staff Sergeant Elena Cruz, scout sniper, attached to this battalion. She climbed the back face of that ridge alone. She had no comms with this talk, no extraction plan, no supporting fires, and no authorization. He paused. She had a rifle and 6 years of training and the willingness to act when no one else could. He let that sit. 7 Marines died today. That is 7 too many. But I want every person in this room to understand one thing clearly. He looked at each of them in turn. The number should have been 480. It is 7 because one person in a briefing room 2 days ago saw what none of us saw, told us what none of us wanted to hear, and when we didn't listen, when I didn't listen, she went and fixed it herself. Captain Yates, sitting 3 chairs from the end, was looking at the table. Not in shame, in something more specific than shame. The feeling of replaying a conversation and understanding exactly where it turned and what he should have said, and knowing that he would never again make the same choice in the same moment. Going forward, Marsh said, this battalion operates differently. If a qualified voice raises a tactical concern in a planning session, that concern is addressed, not dismissed, not minimized, addressed. His voice didn't rise, it didn't need to. Is that understood? A room full of officers said, yes, sir. And this time, unlike 2 days ago, the words meant something. She heard about the debrief secondhand from Yates, who came by at 2100 with 2 cups of bad coffee and the particular expression of a man who needed to deliver information and wasn't sure how to start. He set the coffee on the field table beside her cot and sat down on a camp chair and said, "Marsh named you in the debrief, by name, with everything." Elena looked at him. "He didn't soften it," Yates continued. "He put every decision on the table, including mine, including what I said when you called me about the Ridge movement." He paused. "I told you to get me something concrete when you were looking at the evidence right in front of both of us." "Yates, I need to say this, Cruz." "Okay. I heard you. I heard exactly what you were telling me, and I made a calculation that the risk of redirecting assets based on your read was higher than the risk of doing nothing. And I was wrong." He looked at her. 11 minutes after I told you that, the first gun opened up. Elena picked up the coffee. It was bad, the way compound coffee was always bad, and it was hot, and she was cold from the mountain and the hours and the particular chill that settles into a body after it has been pushed past its limits and then asked to stop. "You were following protocol," she said. "Protocol almost killed 480 Marines." "Yes, it did." She looked at him. "That's the thing about protocol, Yates. It's built on what happened last time. It doesn't know what's happening this time." She paused. "That's why you need the person in the back row, not to break the protocol, to look at what the protocol can't see." Yates was quiet for a moment. "You weren't afraid when you walked out of here," he said. It wasn't a question. "I was terrified," she said. He looked at her. "The climb took 2 hours and 40 minutes. I was terrified for all of it. Not of dying. I've made my peace with that possibility a long time ago. I was terrified I'd get up there and be too late, that I'd reach the first firing position and the battalion would already be gone." She set the coffee down. "That's the fear that moves you, not the fear of what happens to you, the fear of what happens to the people counting on what you're about to do." Yates looked at her for a long moment. "You know," he said finally, "Marsh is recommending you for the Navy Cross." Elena said nothing. "You don't have a reaction to that?" "I have a reaction," she said. "I'm just not sure it's the appropriate one to express to a superior officer." Yates almost smiled. "Try me." She looked at him. 7 Marines didn't make it home today," she said. "If the Navy Cross means something, if it means anything, it means we figure out how to make sure that number doesn't happen again. Not because someone finally listened after the shooting started, but because we build rooms where the right people are heard before it does." She paused. "That's what I want, not a medal, rooms that listen." Yates sat with that for a moment. Outside, the compound had gone quiet. The particular quiet of a military base after a hard day, not peaceful, but exhausted. The kind of quiet that holds the weight of everything that happened and everything that almost happened and sits between them without distinguishing. "Get some sleep, Cruz," Yates said. He stood up. He took his coffee. He walked to the door, and then he stopped without turning around. "For what it's worth," he said, "I'm going to hear you differently from now on." He walked out. Elena Cruz looked at the ceiling of the NCO quarters and listened to the compound settle around her. And she thought about 7 names she still didn't know. And she thought about 473 who were sleeping in this compound tonight because of 3 hours on a ridge with a rifle and a wind gauge, and everything 6 years of silence had taught her about how to see what other people missed. She did not feel like a hero. She felt like someone who had done the only thing there was to do. And then she closed her eyes, and for the first time in 36 hours, she let herself sleep. She slept for 6 hours and woke up before anyone came to tell her. That was how she always woke. Not gradually, not with the slow surfacing of someone climbing out of deep water, but all at once, fully present, the way her body had learned to do after years of living in places where the difference between asleep and awake could be the difference between everything else. She was upright before she knew she decided to sit up, and her hand found the rifle before her eyes fully adjusted. And then she registered the quiet of the compound, and the gray light coming through the small window, and the dull, steady ache in her knee that told her yesterday had been real. She sat still for a moment. 7 names she still didn't know. That was the first thing her mind went to. Not the ridge, not the shots, not the conversation with Marsh or Harris or Yates. 7 names. She'd been thinking about them before she fell asleep, and they were waiting for her when she woke up, patient and heavy and not going anywhere. She got up, put weight on the knee, decided it was manageable and that manageable was sufficient, found her boots. Outside, the compound was running on its morning rhythms. The smell of food from the chow hall, vehicles moving toward the motor pool, the particular sound of a military base putting yesterday away and beginning the machinery of today. She walked to the operations board near the TOC entrance and found what she was looking for. 7 names, posted in the standard format: rank, last name, first initial, unit designation. She read each one. She stood there for 2 minutes and read them and didn't look away, because that was the only thing she knew how to do with this particular weight. Not avoid it, not analyze it, not package it into something manageable. Just carry it. Just let it be the full, undiminished thing it was. Then she walked to the chow hall and got coffee and sat alone at the far end of a table and thought about what came next. What came next arrived faster than she expected. At 0900, a vehicle from the regimental headquarters pulled into the compound. 2 officers she didn't know. A colonel she recognized from a training conference 8 months ago, Colonel James Whitfield, the regimental commander, a lean, precise man with the reputation of someone who made decisions quickly and lived with them completely. Marsh met them at the gate. She watched from across the compound without appearing to watch, the way she'd always been able to observe things without being noticed doing it. She could read the body language from where she sat. Whitfield talking, Marsh listening, the 2 staff officers hanging back in the way that staff officers do when the conversation is above their pay grade, and they know it. Then Marsh looked across the compound and found her. The look wasn't complicated. It was the look of a man who was about to tell her something she wasn't going to like, and who was decent enough to let her see it coming. She put down her coffee. "The regiment wants a full debrief," Marsh said. Whitfield, his S2, his legal officer. They were standing outside the TOC, close enough to speak quietly, and far enough from the morning traffic that the conversation stayed between them. "Legal officer," Elena said. "Yes," she processed that. "They're looking at the unauthorized departure from the compound." "Yes. And the engagements." "Crews." Marsh's voice was even, but his eyes were carrying something careful. "You left a forward operating base without authorization during an active combat operation. You engaged enemy combatants without being assigned to the mission. You operated as a lone actor outside the command structure." He paused. "Everything you did saved lives, and every single thing you did is technically a violation of standing orders." She'd known this was coming. She'd known it before she walked out of the compound. She'd known it, and she'd made the calculation, and she'd walked out anyway. Because the calculation had been simple. 1 woman court-martialed, or 480 Marines who didn't come home. Easy math. "I understand, sir." "Whitfield is a fair man," Marsh said. "He's also a by-the-book man. He's not going to pretend the violations didn't happen just because the outcome was what it was. I'm not asking him to." Marsh looked at her. "I know you're not. I'm telling you what the landscape looks like before you walk into that room." He paused. "For what it's worth, I'll be in the room, and I'll say everything that needs to be said." She nodded once. "What time?" 1100. She looked at her watch. 90 minutes. "Then I have 90 minutes," she said. She spent 45 of them in the small gym at the back of the compound, doing what she always did when her mind needed to work without interruption. Physical repetition, the kind that occupied the body completely and left the mind free to move. Her knee wouldn't take running. She found other things. She worked until the sweat was real and the ache in her leg had been joined by other aches that were cleaner and more honest. And then she sat on the floor and thought through what she was going to say. Not defensively, not strategically. She wasn't going to build a case. She was going to tell exactly what she had seen, what she had decided, and why. And she was going to let Whitfield and his legal officer make of it whatever they were going to make of it. She'd made peace with the outcome on the ridge. She was still at peace with it now. What she hadn't made peace with, what she was still turning over, quietly, in the part of her mind that wouldn't let things go, was the piece of this that nobody had fully named yet. Not in the debrief, not in the conversations with Marsh and Harris and Yates. Everyone had focused on what she'd done. Nobody had sat fully inside the question of why it had been necessary. Not the tactical why, the other one. She'd been in that briefing room. She'd raised her hand. She'd presented a clear, evidence-based analysis of a life-threatening terrain problem. And the room had laughed, and the commander had thanked her for her input and moved on. And Harris had made a joke about radios. Why? Not because her analysis was wrong, it was right. Not because she lacked credentials. She had more relevant experience than most of the men at the front of that room. Not because the information was unclear. She had stated it plainly and directly and without equivocation. Because of who was saying it. That was the thing she was still carrying when she walked into the regimental debrief at 1100. Not anger. She'd processed the anger a long time ago, on a lot of different days that looked a lot like that briefing room. She was carrying the clarity of it, the clean, unambiguous clarity of what had happened and what it had cost, and the knowledge that if nobody was willing to name that part of it, if the report focused on tactics and terrain analysis and the mechanical failures of the planning process, without naming the reason the evidence had been dismissed, then the next briefing room would look exactly like the last one. She walked into the conference room and took a chair and looked at Colonel Whitfield across the table. He was exactly what Marsh had described: lean, precise, direct. He looked at her the way senior officers sometimes looked at complicated problems. Not dismissively, not admiringly, but with the focused attention of someone who needed to understand a situation fully before they decided what to do with it. "Staff Sergeant Cruz," he said. "Sir, walk me through it, from the beginning." She talked for 40 minutes without interruption. Whitfield's S2 took notes. The legal officer, a major named Solis, young for the rank, with the careful eyes of someone who had been told to listen for specific things, wrote in a separate notebook and didn't look up very often. Marsh sat at the end of the table and said nothing. Elena walked through the briefing, the terrain analysis, the dismissal, the radio call about the ridge movement, Yates's response, the moment the guns opened up, the drone feed, the decision. She didn't frame any of it as defense. She presented it the way she would present a sniper's log, factual, sequential, with the reasoning explicit for each decision so that anyone reading it afterward could follow the chain from observation to action without having to guess. When she finished, Whitfield was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You understood when you left this compound that you were violating standing orders?" "Yes, sir." "And you left anyway?" "Yes, sir." "Why didn't you wait for authorization? You had time to attempt to reach Colonel Marsh before departure." She'd expected this question. She'd thought about it carefully. "Sir, I attempted to reach the TOC through Captain Yates. He couldn't reach Colonel Marsh, who was forward with Alpha Company in an active firefight. The authorization chain was inaccessible. The window for reaching the ridge in time to affect the outcome was approximately 2 to 3 hours from the start of the ambush. Every minute I spent trying to find an authority to say yes was a minute the battalion didn't have. She paused. I made a judgment call. I understood the professional consequences, and I accepted them. Whitfield looked at her. What would you have done if you had reached Colonel Marsh and he had ordered you to stand down? The room was very quiet. It was the most direct question anyone had asked her, and it was the right question, and she wasn't going to answer it with anything except the truth. Sir, I have thought about that question very carefully, and I believe the answer depends on what Colonel Marsh said when he gave that order. If he had a plan, if there was an asset I didn't know about, a capability that was being brought to bear that would have achieved the same result without me going up that ridge, then yes, I would have stood down. She met Whitfield's eyes. But if the answer was hold and wait, sir, if the answer was the same answer that the manuals had and the protocols had and that everyone in that TOC was already giving, then I don't know what I would have done. Whitfield said nothing. I'm not proud of that answer, she said, but it's honest. The legal officer had stopped writing. Whitfield called a break at 12:30. He walked out with Marsh, and the two of them stood in the corridor for 8 minutes. Elena sat at the conference table and drank water and watched Solis review his notes and didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say. When Marsh came back in, his face had shifted. Not dramatically, he wasn't a dramatic man, but something had settled in it. The way things settle when a decision has been made and the making of it has clarified rather than complicated. Whitfield sat back down. Staff Sergeant Cruz, he said, I'm going to tell you what I think, and then I'm going to tell you what happens next. Yes, sir. What you did was tactically brilliant, operationally unauthorized, and personally extraordinary. It was also exactly the kind of unilateral action that, in a different situation with a different outcome, could have gotten additional Marines killed and created a recovery problem on top of an existing disaster. He held her gaze. The fact that your judgment was correct does not retroactively make the decision to act without authorization the right institutional precedent. Do you understand the distinction I'm drawing? Yes, sir, I do. Good, he leaned forward, because the distinction matters. Not because I'm interested in punishing you, but because this institution functions on the principle that individual judgment, however excellent, operates within a command structure for reasons that go beyond any single engagement. He paused. If I let this pass without acknowledgement, I'm telling every Marine in this regiment that the command structure is optional when you're confident enough. That's not a message I'm willing to send. Elena nodded. At the same time, Whitfield continued, and his voice shifted almost imperceptibly, I am also not willing to look at what you did on that ridge. The preparation, the execution, the physical and tactical demands of it, performed alone and without support, and treated as a footnote to a disciplinary finding. He looked at Marsh. Colonel Marsh has recommended you for the Navy Cross. I'm adding my endorsement to that recommendation. She said nothing. Additionally, I am formally requesting that you be reassigned from your current advisory status to an operational billet within 3rd Battalion, effective upon your medical clearance. He paused. Not as an advisor, as a sniper. Assigned, integrated, and operationally mandated. The battalion needs you. They've needed you for the last 6 months, and nobody was paying attention. He looked at Solis. Major, the formal finding? Solis looked up from his notebook. Letter of counseling for unauthorized departure from a forward operating base. No further disciplinary action. He paused. The letter will reflect the exceptional circumstances and will not be forwarded for inclusion in the permanent service record. Elena sat with that for a moment. A letter of counseling. The mildest possible official acknowledgement that a rule had technically been broken. The kind of finding that said we noted this and nothing more. Sir, she said to Whitfield, I have one thing I'd like to say before we close. Go ahead. She took a breath. Not because she was uncertain, because the thing she was about to say mattered enough to be said carefully. The 7 men who died in that valley died because the planning process failed to account for the terrain risk. The terrain risk was identified and presented and dismissed. She paused. I'm not asking for anything to be added to the record about that. I'm not asking for accountability beyond what Colonel Marsh has already taken on himself. But I would like to ask, sir, formally, on the record, that the regiment review its planning protocols to address how dissenting tactical assessments are processed. Not to protect me, to protect the next unit that walks into the next briefing room with the next version of this problem. She met Whitfield's eyes. 7 names were on the board this morning, sir. I'd like to make sure that board is shorter next time. The room was quiet. Whitfield looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "That request is noted, and it will be acted on." Maybe the news moved through the compound the way news always moved through a military base, faster than official channels and more accurate than the rumor mill, carried by the particular network of soldiers who had been in rooms and corridors and heard fragments of things and assembled them into a picture that was usually more right than wrong. By 1400, most of the battalion knew the outline. Crews had been debriefed, no charges, letter of counseling, operational billet in 3rd Battalion, Navy Cross recommendation endorsed by the regiment. Danny Reyes heard it from Torres, who had heard it from the TOC watch officer's driver, and he sat with it for a moment in the shade outside the motor pool, with his arm still in a sling, turning it over. Navy Cross, Torres said. Yeah, she deserves it. She deserves more than a medal, Reyes said. She deserves a room that listens. He paused. But I'll take the Navy Cross as a start. Torres leaned against the vehicle beside him. His color was better today. The particular gray pallor of blood loss had started to lift, replaced by something more ordinary, the tiredness of someone who had been genuinely scared and was only now beginning to let himself feel how scared he'd been. You know what I keep thinking about? Torres said. What? That voice on the radio, that corporal, whoever it was, when the first gun went quiet. He shook his head. He said somebody's cutting them apart. And I remember exactly what that felt like to hear. I was behind that vehicle thinking there was no way out, thinking about things I don't want to think about. And then that voice came up and said, somebody's up there. And it changed everything. He paused. It wasn't the gun going quiet. It was knowing someone had chosen to be up there. That someone had climbed that ridge to come for us. Reyes said nothing. She didn't know us, Torres continued. She didn't know my name. She didn't know any of us. She looked at the problem and she went and fixed it. He looked at Reyes. How do you say thank you for something like that? Reyes thought about it. I don't think you do, he said finally. I think you live well enough to make it worth what it cost her to give it to you. Harris came to find her in the late afternoon. She was in the small courtyard behind the NCO quarters, sitting in a chair with her leg up and her notebook open, writing. He came around the corner and stopped when he saw her, because for a fraction of a second she looked so completely ordinary, just a Marine with a notebook and a coffee, writing something in the afternoon quiet, that the image sat strangely against everything that he now understood about who she was. Cruz, she looked up. The debrief went well, he said. It wasn't a question, he'd heard the outcome. It went fair, she said, which is better than well. He nodded, came and sat in the other chair without asking, which she took as a sign that something had changed between the awkward apology in the aid station and whatever he'd been thinking about in the hours since. I've been writing letters, he said. She looked at him. To the families. He said it without drama, with the weight of someone who did this work not because it was asked of him, but because he had decided it was owed. I write them all, every time. He paused. The 2 men I lost yesterday, I wrote their letters this morning, and he stopped. She waited. I couldn't write them the way I normally write them, he said. Normally I can say, he served with distinction. He died in combat. His sacrifice was meaningful. And I can mean it. I can mean every word. He looked at her. But yesterday, knowing what I know about how that valley was planned, knowing what I dismissed in that briefing room, I couldn't write those letters the same way. Because there's a version of that day where those men don't die. And I know what that version is, and I know what it required. Elena said nothing. I don't know what to do with that, he said. I don't know how you carry it when you know the loss was preventable. She thought about that for a moment. You carry it the same way you carry any of it, she said. You don't put it down. You don't resolve it. You let it change how you do the next thing. She paused. The letters you wrote this morning, were they honest? Yes. Then they were right. The families deserve honesty more than they deserve comfort. She closed her notebook. And the men you lost deserved a commander who carry what happened. You're carrying it. That's not nothing. Harris looked at the wall across the courtyard. I'm going to be a different officer after this, he said. Not as resolution, as fact, the way people state things when they've already stopped debating them internally. I know, she said. He looked at her. How do you know? Because you came back twice, she said. Aid station last night, here now. Men who aren't going to change don't come back twice. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something she didn't expect. The regiment is talking about using the Kandar Valley action as a case study in the next training cycle. Planning failures, terrain analysis, the whole thing. He paused. They're going to want you to brief it. She looked at him. You, he said, not as a footnote, as the primary instructor, the whole battalion, what you saw in the briefing room, how you read the terrain, the decisions on the ridge. He paused. Marsh asked me to bring it to you because he thought you might be more likely to hear it from me. She sat with that. Why me? She said, though she already knew. Because the lesson isn't the tactics, Harris said. The lesson is what you saw that nobody else saw. And the only person who can teach that is the person who saw it. He met her gaze. You said you wanted rooms that listen. This is how you build them. One briefing at a time. The afternoon light had gone flat in gold, the way it did in the mountains before the temperature dropped, and the compound was running through its evening transition. And somewhere across the base, a group of Marines were doing something loud and ordinary that had nothing to do with valleys or ridges or 7 names on a board. Elena Cruz looked at the notebook in her lap. She thought about the briefing room, the burnt coffee and the overconfidence, and her hand going up, and the laughter and the patient dismissal, and 4 words in a small notebook. Northern Ridges, 20 minutes. She thought about what it would mean to stand at the front of a room, not the back, the front, and show the next generation of officers exactly how you look at a valley and see a kill box. Exactly what evidence looks like when it's being dismissed. Exactly what the cost of a laugh in a briefing room can be when the terrain doesn't care about your confidence. She thought about 7 names on a board. Tell Marsh yes, she said. Harris nodded. He stood up to leave, and then he stopped. Not the door-stopping hesitation of apology, but something different. Something more like the way people stop when they've been carrying a sentence around all day and finally found the right moment for it. Cruz, sir, for what it's worth, he said it quietly, with the particular honesty of a man who had spent most of his career being the loudest person in the room and was learning, slowly and at real cost, how to be the most honest one instead. I know it shouldn't take 480 people nearly dying before someone actually sees you. She looked at him. No, she said, it shouldn't. He nodded once. Then he walked away, and she opened her notebook again, and she started writing the briefing that she was going to give to a room full of officers who needed to understand that the battlefield always told you the truth. And the only question was whether you were willing to listen to the person who could read it. The briefing was scheduled for 0800 on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the valley. Elena's knee had been cleared for full duty 6 days prior. Hairline fracture, confirmed, healed faster than the medical officer had predicted, which he attributed to physical conditioning and she attributed to not having the time or inclination to let it do otherwise. She'd spent the 3 weeks between the debrief and this morning doing 2 things simultaneously: preparing the case study that Marsh and Harris had asked for, and doing the job she'd been doing for 6 years in the same compound with the same rifle on a new set of orders that finally put her name where it should have been from the beginning. Operationally assigned, fully integrated, not an advisor, a sniper. She stood outside the briefing room at 0750 and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not nervousness. She'd been shot at on a 70-degree rock face with a bad knee, and she hadn't felt nervous then. This was different. This was the particular weight of standing at a threshold she'd spent 6 years approaching from the wrong direction, and knowing that what happened in the next 2 hours would either build the things she'd told Yates she wanted, rooms that listened, or it wouldn't. And there was no ridge to climb if the room went wrong. There was only the words she'd prepared and the people she was about to say them to. Reyes found her in the corridor. His arm was out of the sling. He walked with the easy economy of someone whose body had finished processing what it had been through and was ready to move again. He looked at her, then at the closed door of the briefing room, then back at her. "How many in there?" she asked. "Full house," he said. "Both companies. All the officers from the Kandar planning cycle. Whitfield sent 3 observers from regiment." He paused. "Harris is in the front row." She absorbed that. "How is he?" "Different," Reyes said. He said it the way she'd said it to him in the courtyard. Not as judgment, just as fact. Quieter. Pays attention to things he used to walk past. He looked at her. "He's been talking to the junior NCOs differently, asking questions before giving orders, listening to the answers." A pause. "It's noticeable." "Good," she said. Reyes was quiet for a moment. Then, "You ready for this?" She thought about it honestly, the way she'd learned to think about things. Not the answer she was supposed to give, not the answer that sounded right, but the actual one. "No," she said, "but I'm going in anyway." He almost smiled. "Sounds familiar." She pushed the door open. The room was full, and it was loud with the particular noise of a large group settling. Chairs scraping, conversations finishing, the rustle of people who didn't yet know they were about to hear something that would stay with them. She walked to the front without ceremony, set her notebook on the podium, and looked at the room. 200 faces. Officers and NCOs, and the 3 observers from regiment sitting along the wall with their own notebooks. Harris in the front row, exactly where Reyes had said, his hands folded, his eyes on her. She didn't start with the valley. She started with a question. How many of you have been in a planning session where someone said something you disagreed with and you didn't respond? The room was quiet. A few hands went up. Cautious, the kind of hands that go up when people aren't sure if they're walking into a trap. Keep your hand up if the thing you didn't respond to turned out to be right. Most of the hands stayed up. She looked at them. "Put them down," she said. "That's the briefing." The room stayed quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now. The kind that happens when a room full of trained people suddenly understands that what they're about to hear is not a tactical debrief. It's a mirror. She opened her notebook. 3 weeks ago, I sat in the back row of a room very much like this one and raised my hand during a mission planning session. She kept her voice even. Not dramatic, factual. The drama was already in the room without her manufacturing it. I presented a terrain analysis that identified a significant risk to the mission. The analysis was dismissed. The mission proceeded. 7 Marines died. 473 others came within a margin I am not comfortable calling luck. She paused. I want to walk you through that analysis. Not to tell you I was right. You already know I was right. I want to show you how I read it, what I was looking at, and why the information I had was not different from the information that was available to every person in that room. Because the failure at Kandar Valley was not an intelligence failure. It was not a planning failure in the technical sense. She looked at the room. It was a listening failure. And listening failures are the only category of failure that you can fix before the shooting starts. She talked for 40 minutes before the first real break in the room's composure. She had mapped the terrain analysis precisely, not to show off, but to demonstrate the exact chain of observation and inference that had led her to the conclusion she'd reached in the original briefing. She showed how she'd read the ridgeline convergence. She showed the firing angles. She showed the relationship between the extraction routes and the elevated positions and the specific geometry that made the valley unworkable as a sweep objective without a plan for the high ground. Every bit of it was information that had been available in the same briefing room 3 weeks ago. A lieutenant in the third row, young, attentive, the kind of officer who wrote everything down, raised his hand partway through. Sergeant Cruz, the drone surveillance showed no activity on the ridgelines before the mission. If the analysis was correct, why didn't the surveillance support it? Good question, she said. The surveillance showed no activity because the enemy was already in position before the surveillance window. Staging overnight, below the thermal profile of the cameras, in natural depressions that the camera operators weren't tasking specifically because nobody had told them to look there. She looked at him. The surveillance didn't support my analysis because nobody asked it the right question. And nobody asked it the right question because my analysis had been dismissed before anyone thought to task the cameras differently. The lieutenant wrote something. That, she said to the room, is how a listening failure compounds. You dismiss the concern. The concern shapes what you don't look for. What you don't look for, you don't find. What you don't find, you assume doesn't exist. And then the valley opens up. Harris, in the front row, was completely still. She recognized the stillness. It was the same stillness she'd seen in Marsh's face when he sat across from her in the aid station. The stillness of someone who was replaying something and seeing it differently every time it ran. The twist came 45 minutes in, and it came from a direction nobody in the room expected. One of Whitfield's observers, a major named Caldwell, compact and attentive, who had been writing in his notebook without looking up for most of the session, set down his pen. Sergeant Cruz. His voice was precise, not hostile, precise in the way of someone who has been sent to ask a specific question and is finally ready to ask it. The regiment has reviewed the Kandar Valley action in detail, not just the tactical events, the full sequence, including the planning cycle. The room shifted. Something about his tone changed the temperature. Yes, sir, she said. In the review, we identified a pattern. He paused. This was not the first planning session in which you raised a terrain or tactical concern that was not fully addressed. Our records show 3 previous instances over the last 8 months, 2 training exercises, 1 mission planning cycle for an operation that was subsequently canceled, in which your input was noted and not acted upon. The room was very quiet now. Elena said nothing. She waited. What that tells us, Caldwell continued, is that the Kandar Valley was not an isolated failure. It was the last in a series of smaller failures that nobody caught because the consequences were, until Kandar, survivable. He looked at her. My question, Sergeant, is this. In those 3 previous instances, what happened when your input wasn't acted on? She thought about it. I wrote it in my notebook and moved on, she said. Why? Because pushing back against a decision that's already been made in an environment where the culture doesn't support dissent costs you the credibility you need for the next time you try to push back. She paused. You learn very quickly how much of your capital to spend and when. And the cost of that calculation? She looked at him steadily. The cost was 3 weeks ago in a valley in Kandar province, she said. Sir. The room absorbed that. She could feel it. the collective reckoning of people who had been in rooms, who had made the same calculation, who had written things in notebooks and moved on, and never fully sat inside the question of what the moving on had cost. Caldwell nodded slowly. "That's exactly what I needed to hear," he said. He looked at the room. "And I want every officer in this room to understand what she just told you. The problem wasn't one briefing. The problem was a culture that trained a highly qualified person to expect to be dismissed. And she had learned correctly that the system would not protect her credibility if she pushed too hard." He paused. "That culture exists in your unit. It exists in every unit, and it is actively making you less safe." The room said nothing. Harris was looking at the floor. Marsh, who was standing at the back of the room, she hadn't seen him come in, was looking at Caldwell with the expression of someone hearing the thing they needed to hear, said by the person whose institutional authority made it land differently than when it came from someone else. The second part of the briefing was different in texture from the first. Elena walked them through the Ridge operation not as a triumph, but as an emergency. The thing that had become necessary because the system failed at every prior checkpoint. She made that explicit, and she didn't soften it. She showed the decision point at the TOC, the inaccessibility of the authorization chain, the calculations she'd made, and she showed it not as heroism, but as the stark arithmetic of a moment where every sanctioned option had been exhausted. A captain near the middle of the room, she didn't know his name, said something that stopped her mid-sentence. "Sergeant Cruz." His voice wasn't challenging. It was genuinely uncertain in the way of someone working through something in real time. "If you had to do it again, if you were back in that TOC with the same information and the same authorization chain and the same window, would you go?" She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "I would go." "Without authorization?" "Yes." He sat with that. How do you live with that? With the fact that the right answer was to break the rules? She thought about it carefully. "I don't think the right answer was to break the rules," she said. "I think the right answer was to do what needed to be done and accept the consequences of doing it, and then do everything possible to make sure the system never puts another person in that position again." She paused. "Breaking rules and accepting responsibility are two different things. I did both. The breaking was necessary. The accepting was mandatory. And the work we're doing right now, this room, this briefing, is the third part. Making sure the break doesn't have to happen again." The captain wrote something. She kept going. Reyes was waiting for her outside the briefing room when it ended. He'd been in the back for the second half. She'd seen him come in during the break, stand against the wall with his arms folded, and stay. He had the look now of someone who had heard something confirmed that he'd already suspected. "How was it?" she asked. "Harris cried," he said. She stopped walking. "He didn't fall apart," Reyes said quickly. "It wasn't, he kept it together. But I was 2 seats away from him, and when you were talking about the 3 previous instances, the pattern, the culture, I watched his face and he paused. He understood that the briefing room he laughed in wasn't a one-time mistake. It was the end of a long line of moments, and he was part of that line before he was ever in the room with you." She was quiet. "That's a hard thing to sit with," she said. "Yeah," Reyes said. "I think that's why he's going to sit with it." Marsh found her at 1700, near the end of the working day, sitting at the intelligence terminal where she'd watched the drone feed begin the whole chain of events 3 weeks ago. She wasn't watching anything now, just sitting, the way she sometimes needed to sit after something that had required everything. He pulled up a chair. He didn't say anything immediately, which she appreciated. He sat with her for a moment in the shared quiet of 2 people who had been through something together and didn't need to narrate it to each other. Then he said, "Whitfield called me after the briefing." She looked at him. "The regiment is implementing a formal protocol change. Dissenting tactical assessments during planning cycles have to be addressed on the record, not just acknowledged, addressed. Whoever raises the concern gets a documented response from the planning officer explaining why it was accepted or rejected. He paused. And if the operation executes and the dissenting assessment proves accurate, that record gets reviewed in the after action. She absorbed that. That's more than I asked for, she said. You asked for rooms that listen, he said. Whitfield is building the mechanism. The room is a culture problem. The mechanism enforces the culture until the culture changes itself. He looked at her. It won't be perfect. The first few implementations will be clunky. Officers will feel like they're being watched. Some of them will comply in form and not in substance. He paused. But it's a start. It's a start, she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. The Navy Cross recommendation was formally submitted to HQMC this morning, he said, with Whitfield's endorsement and mine. He looked at her. And a full written account of the 3 previous planning cycles. I want the record to show not just what you did on the ridge, but why it became necessary. She looked at him. Sir, you didn't have to include the previous cycles. Yes, I did, he said simply. A medal without the context of how it was earned is just metal. The context is the lesson. The lesson is what protects the next person who raises their hand in a room like that one. He met her eyes. You told me to carry it. I'm carrying it. This is how. She had no response to that. She didn't need one. They sat for a moment longer in the quiet of the operations center, and the compound moved around them the way it always moved. Purposeful, loud in patches, and quiet in others. The ordinary machinery of a military base doing the 1,000 ordinary things that happened on either side of the extraordinary ones. 2 days later, the battalion held a formation. It was a standard afternoon formation. Attendance, announcements, the routine business of a large unit maintaining its own cohesion. Elena stood in her place in the formation the way she always had. Present, attentive, unremarkable to anyone passing by who didn't know what they were looking at. Marsh read the orders. She was officially assigned to 3rd Expeditionary Battalion, Scout Sniper Platoon, with full operational status. He read it in the flat, efficient language of military orders, and when he finished reading it, the formation was quiet for a moment. Then Danny Reyes started clapping. Not the formal, ceremonial applause of a planned event, the spontaneous, genuine applause of someone who had decided that the moment required it, regardless of protocol. Torres joined immediately, then 2 other Marines in the 2nd rank, then a 3rd. Then Harris, from his position at the head of Alpha Company, bringing his hands together with a deliberateness that had nothing performative in it, just a man acknowledging something true. Within 15 seconds, the entire formation was applauding. It wasn't a thunderous sound. It was a compound of 200 and some Marines clapping in a late afternoon in Kandahar province. And it lasted for maybe 12 seconds. And then it stopped, and the formation stood at attention again, and the world kept moving. But Elena Cruz stood inside those 12 seconds and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not vindication. Vindication was the wrong word. It implied she'd been waiting for something, and she hadn't been waiting. She'd been working. She'd been doing the job, in the back row, and on the ridge, and in the briefing room, every single day, whether anyone was watching or not. What she felt was simpler than vindication. She felt seen. Not by everyone, not by every officer in every room, not by the institution as a whole, which would take years and many more briefing rooms and many more people willing to raise their hands and many more commanders willing to sit inside the discomfort of what it meant to have not listened. That was not a problem she had solved. That was a problem she had named. But in this compound, in this formation, with these people, the people who had been in the valley and the people who had been in the TOC and the people who had watched the drone feed and heard the guns go quiet and said into a radio that somebody was up there cutting them apart, in this specific place, she was seen. That was enough. It was more than enough. Later, after the formation dismissed and the compound returned to its evening rhythms, Reyes fell in beside her as she walked. He didn't say anything for a moment. They walked in the companionable silence of people who had been through something together and didn't need to fill every space. Then he said, "You ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't been in that briefing room?" She thought about it. "I think about the 7 names," she said. "I think about what the number would have been if the guns had run for another hour without anyone breaking the command node." She paused. "And then I think about the fact that there was a room, and I was in it, and I had the training and the years and the silence, all that silence, and I had a notebook and a pen, and I wrote 4 words." She paused. "And then the moment came, and I went." Reyes nodded. "That's it," she said. "That's the whole thing. You prepare, you wait, you see the moment, and you go. Not because someone authorized it, not because the room agreed with you, because you prepared for it, and you saw it, and it was yours to do." He was quiet for a moment. "What's next?" he asked. She looked at the mountains, the same mountains that 3 weeks ago had held a bowl full of smoke and gunfire, and 7 men who hadn't come home. They looked the same from here, indifferent, patient, permanent in the way that mountains are permanent, owing nothing to the small, fierce business that humans conducted on their faces. She thought about the briefings she'd just given, the protocol change Whitfield was implementing, the letter of counseling in a file that would tell the story of what she'd chosen and what it had cost. The Navy Cross recommendation making its way through a chain of desks toward a decision that someone who hadn't been in the valley would make from a comfortable chair. She thought about every back row she'd ever sat in. She thought about what it meant to have finally been moved to the front. "The next thing," she said, "is the same as the last thing. Show up, pay attention, say what's true even when the room doesn't want to hear it. Go when the moment comes." She looked at Reyes. "And make sure the room is a little more willing to listen than it was the last time." He nodded once. "That sounds like a life's work," he said. She looked back at the mountains. "Yes," she said, "it does." And Elena Cruz, Scout Sniper, 3rd Expeditionary Battalion, the woman no one had trusted and everyone had underestimated and nobody had been able to stop, walked back into the compound, picked up her rifle, and went to work. Because that was what she had always done. And now, finally, the room knew it.